Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Joydeep Shorangi, Jogesh Chandra Choudhury College, University of Calcutta, Kolkata. Today we are going to learn chapter 5 on Beowulf, first epic poem written by the Anglo-Saxon people after their settlement in Britain. This module is prepared by Professor Vidya-mitra Kaur, Women's College, Kolkata. Friends, first please remember that Beowulf is the first epic poem written in England, but not necessarily written in the language as we know it, English language. It was first written in West Saxon language, a dialect of Anglo-Saxon languages. In this particular module, we are going to learn the structure and theme of Beowulf, use of legends in the epic as the subtext, epic qualities of the text, elements of Christianity in Beowulf, the monsters of Beowulf, and the poetic style of Beowulf. With these parameters, let us begin. We begin our discussion with Beowulf with some essential facts. Beowulf is the most known poem and most well known epic in the entire corpus of Anglo-Saxon literature. Why it is so? Because it has been considered to be the first epic poem of the Anglo-Saxon people in Britain. The poem consists of 3,182 lines written in West Saxon language. It revolves around the central character Beowulf, where Beowulf is the protagonist. It exploits the heroic deeds of the protagonist called Beowulf. The epic is found in the manuscript called Cotton Vitellius A15. The poem has occasioned many critical debates whether it is an epic poem or not. But due to some very prominent and glaring characteristics, we assign the poem as the first epic poem written by the Anglo-Saxon, written during the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, when you talk about something which dates back such a length, we talk about the date of composition. Beowulf presents the amalgamation of historical reality and the fantasy of the unknown author. We are aware of the fact that Anglo-Saxon literature is anonymous. That means tracing back or falling back to the authorship is a big doubt. These historical facts help to determine that possible date of composition of the poem, but all guesswork. The historical facts in Beowulf is the mention of the death of Hygelac, who died in 528 CE, and the reference to the hero of the Danish origin. That means Beowulf is written around 520-530 AD. This shows that the poem was written after the Danish invasions and who have settled down in England. The formulaic pattern employed in the poem shows that the poem was composed around 725 AD, the heyday of bardic poetry. Thus, two dates are there. We have 520s AD and 720s AD. That suggests the poem must have been written between these two time frames. Epic usually requires a long time to grow orally, till some poet decides to write it down. But remember, as the authorship is in doubt, we cannot claim a specific date of its composition. Keeping the dates in mind, we may refer to Beowulf, the poet must be a Danish ancestry and must have the original from Anglia. So it was written first in Anglian dialect. It was later copied by the cleric in West Saxon, who perhaps has incorporated some of the passages of his own. But remember, the spread of Christianity was an important factor during that time. So the intermingling of pagan and Christian elements made the epic so special. Now friends, let us talk about the structure of the epic. Beowulf as an epic poem can be divided into two parts. Line number 1 to 2199 that relates to Beowulf's arrival in Denmark from Great Geatland, his killing of monster Grendel and his mother. So in this part we find two battles, one Beowulf involving with Grendel and the second with Grendel's mother. And in part 2 that begins from line number 2200, that begins 50 years after the first part, when Beowulf has established himself as a king of the Geats. Now Beowulf is old. The safety of his kingdom is threatened by a dragon. Now in this chapter there is an elaborate description of Beowulf's fight with the dragon. Beowulf kills the dragon and is mortally wounded himself. The poem ends with the description of Beowulf's funeral. The poem uses digressive passages from various sources like the Bible and other heroic sagas. Critics often claim that these Christian elements were incorporated later on. Now let us talk about digressions that we come across in the epic poem. The first group of digressions includes references to legendary figures like the heroes. The skilled Skafing was established ruler of the Danes, followed by Beowulf. Hrothgar, who belongs to the house of Skilled, has established himself as a great king and has built the Heorot, the hall, and he portrayed as a king old whose kingdom is threatened by the monster whom Beowulf would kill. Sigmund the Dragon Slayer, who features in Icelandic and Nordic sagas. Hamma, who stole the necklace of brass wings. The avaricious Hermund, Queen Modith, and others alluded to the epic. So these are the references that prove to be digressive as well as references to some historical facts. There are four main digressions. For instance, the blood feud between different Germanic tribes, which led the undoing of the entire community. There, the feud between the Danes and the Swedes, which was attempted to resolve by a marriage alliance but failed. The feud between the Finns and the Danes, which is also reported in a 48-line long poem, The Fight at Finnsburg. We have referred to the fight at Finnsburg while dealing with heroic poems in the previous module. The feud between Heathbirds and the Danes, the feud between Geats and Swedes. These feuds reveal how the various Germanic tribes would finally be destroyed, but mutual hatred and treacherous and tremendous desire for revenge. So possibly you have an idea of how things went in the epic poem. The other set of digressions refer to Christian literature. Why Christian literature is important, we have had enough discussion so far. The story of Cain and Abel, the flood, the story of creation, the homiletic passages that speak of the everlasting happiness of heaven, all these are references to Christian literature or especially to the Bible. Now, let us talk about the heroic society in Beowulf. The epic poem presents a holistic picture of a heroic society. Why heroic society? If we talk about the lives as painted in epic poems like the Iliad, like the Odyssey, like the Ramayana, like the Aeneid, like the Mahabharata, all talk about the heroic society where brave heroes are born. The character of Beowulf is drawn in the image of Sigismund and the legendary hero of Germanic sagas. The poem represents the theme of leadership in the heroic society through Beowulf. He is keenest to win fame by his prowess and just rule. The other important symbols are monsters and the mead hall. And all epic poems deal with supernatural agencies, and Beowulf is not an exception. Beowulf's death suggests the fall of an entire race, the collapse of that particular tribe. The poem is permeated by an elegiac note, and the ending with a funeral is really euphoristic, and it is an important aspect of the heroic literature too. Now, friends, by the time you have had some sort of idea about Beowulf, but let us debate with whether Beowulf can be called an epic poem truly or not. Many critics believe that Beowulf lacks unity of action. However, others suggest that epic qualities can hardly be overlooked. Beowulf is a condensed epic. Heorot is a microcosmic representation of this universe, because all epic poems are the prognosis or the representation of the entire community. Here Beowulf is not an exception. The poem exhibits a deep understanding of history, objective treatment of death, traditional narrative devices, a simple universe with well-defined human relationship. The poem may lack unity of action, but it has unity of consciousness. Some critics think that Beowulf is only of 3,000 and odd lines. It cannot match with 24 books of the Iliad or 24 books of the Odyssey. So, it lacks the length of any epic poem. But remember, some other qualities that the epic poem Beowulf shows are truly epical, like the agencies of supernatural, the same thing, the epic similes, and the grand style, and the representation of life. It is addressed to men, about men, and written by man. So, it has a vast canvas, panoramic canvas. The hero is a traveling hero like Rama or Yudhishthira, so that he travels a lot. So, if we make a comparative analysis with other established epics in the world, if the poem stands out as one of the significant contributions as an epic poem during the Anglo-Saxon literary corpus or period. But at the same time, it cannot be only all positives of claiming it an epic poem. At the same time, it lacks the standard epic poem formulae of Iliad, of the Odyssey, or the Ramayana, or the Mahabharata, or the Aeneid. Now, friends, the monsters in the Beowulf, the monsters create a fairy tale atmosphere. If we consider other epic poems that you have understood or you have read so far in your childhood or so, all epic poems deal with fairy tale atmosphere. They represent the fear of common man, of course, because epic poems are not far away or far removed from life. They also have symbolic purpose. The epic poems are not only the poems for reading for the sake of reading, they have moral values altogether. And friends, now an important facet of Beowulf as a Christian poem. As you know, when at the time Beowulf was written, that was a very transitory time in Britain, when the Christianization or baptization was approaching in a mass scale. So the Beowulf later on was infused with certain passages from Christian texts. For example, the topic of Christianity is being debated again and again. The scholars who believe that Beowulf is a Christian poem refers to the instances of digression and digression to Christian theological literature and homiletic tone of the poem. Harold Boom is one of the pioneer critics who consider Beowulf as not only a Christian poet, but also it does not refer to the New Testament. So if a poem is out and out a Christian poem, it has to refer certain passages from New Testament. These passages are examples of interpolations done by the clerks and who copied the poem from one particular dialect to another dialect. So the poem written with a purpose to convert man doesn't stand with solid grounds. Friends, after reading or listening to Beowulf, let us conclude by knowing something on the stylistic devices used in Beowulf. The epic poem is known for grand style. May it be the Ramayana, may it be the Mahabharata, or the Aeneid, the Iliad, or the Odyssey. The stylistic features of Beowulf are the dramatic beginning. In all epic poems, if we consider, that begin with addresses to the muses, apostrophe to the muses, or muses are invoked, and Beowulf is not an exception. It begins dramatically. The alliterative use of sounds, wordplay, kennings, and the use of composite words, variation, and formulaic repetition. So these are parts and parcel of the grand style of the epic poem Beowulf, which match with the style that we come across with other epic poems written in different languages across the globe. Thank you.
So, seeing as this is the first in this series of talks called Great Writers Inspire, I'm going to talk about what's often regarded as the first great text in English literature, the long Old English poem that we now call Beowulf. I'm going to ask a few questions about what we mean when we say a writer in the Anglo-Saxon period, and whether we can really talk of the Beowulf poet in the way we talk of, say, Swift or Blake or some of the other writers who will be discussed later on. Beowulf survives today in just one manuscript copy. This was made by two scribes. We call them rather unimaginatively scribes A and B. They were working around the year 1000, we know that from the handwriting. And the manuscript is now in the British Library. You can go and see it, it's on public display most of the time. As you can see from the slide, the manuscript's not in very good condition. It is 1,000 years old. It's something of a miracle that it survives at all. A lot of Anglo-Saxon manuscripts were destroyed in the Norman Conquest. The few that survived that didn't survive the dissolution of the monasteries. Beowulf also survived a fire in 1731. It was thrown out of a library window, so we're really very lucky to have it. Some of the leaves of the manuscript are actually singed around the edges, not this one in fact, but it's still in pretty bad condition. Of course, the scribe who wrote these particular lines of Beowulf, scribe A, wasn't the poet, although he might be said to be the author or editor of the text that we now read, in that this scribe provides us with our only version of this part of the Beowulf story. There could, of course, have been as many versions of this story as there were Anglo-Saxon poets to tell it. Each poet could have amplified or embellished parts of this story to suit his audience. In fact, as we'll see, in the poem that we now have, there are several examples of oral poets, or shops as they're called in Old English, shaping or adapting traditional tales. If we look at the first few lines of Beowulf then, which is on the next slide, we can see how the poet presents himself in the role of a traditional narrator. He's engaging a listening audience in a collective act of remembrance, and I'll just read that for you in Old English. What we gardena in gardeum, theod kuninga thrum jefrunen, who the athelingers ellen fremeden. So if I translate that word for word, it means something like, what, or listen, we of the spear Danes in days of yore, people kings' might or strength have learnt about. So we have learnt about the might or strength of Danish kings in days of yore, how those athelings achieved glory. So the narrator wants us to think of him as part of a group. We have heard these things. He's someone who mediates cultural memory through story. He's not an original artist in the modern sense, but rather a guardian of tales which are part of a common inheritance. The inherited nature of this story is emphasized throughout the poem. He keeps using phrases like ich jefran, I have learnt, or ich jehört, I heard. And the narrator often refers to Germanic legends in a very elusive and sometimes even cryptic way, which certainly implies that his audience was already familiar with much of this material. But how traditional is Beowulf, and to what extent is the poet engaged in creating a new original text? So the Old English word for poet or singer, shop, is related to the Old English verb shippen, to shape or create. Anglo-Saxons are very interested in the myth of the oral poet. Bede tells the story of Cadman, who was an illiterate cowherd who received the gift of poetry from God. This is a sort of origin myth then for English poetry. In another 10th century or early 11th century manuscript called the Exeter Book, you've got two poems called Deor and Widsith, which describe oral poets lamenting the fact that they don't now have a status in society or a job. In Beowulf, there are several passages where a Danish shop is carefully described in the act of shaping old tales into new forms. One effect of these performances is to give us a kind of interpretive gloss for the events of the main narrative. So, for example, the building of the Great Hall, Herot, is marked by Sutol sang shoppers, the sweet or clear song of the shop. And this shop or poet paraphrases Genesis 1, telling us how se almitiga lif el ye shop, so how the Almighty shaped or created all of life. So this pun on shop and yesheop identifies the act of poetic shaping with that of divine creation. And in fact, in Old English, shippened is a common word for God. The shop's ability to explain human history in terms of biblical story also aligns him with the narrator, who consistently grounds his tale in the mythical patterns of the Old Testament. So Grendel's exile from Herot and his assaults on the newly created hall echo the falls of Lucifer and Adam and Eve, in fact. And Grendel's status as an exile is explained by the narrator in terms of a genealogy which traces his ancestry back to Cain. During the feasting in Herot, after Beowulf's defence of the hall against Grendel, Hrothgar's shop sings an abridged version of a story called the Freswal, the Frisian slaughter. This story was well known to the Anglo-Saxons. It's featured in another poem that we call the Finnsburg Fragment. In the fragment, you get the focus on the defence of the hall, but in Beowulf, the shop focuses instead on the themes of maternal grief and the impulse towards revenge. The shop's choice of material turns out to be prophetic, as Grendel's mother is soon going to attack Herot, in fact the same night, in revenge for the killing of her own son. Another example of the art of the oral poet occurs when another shop celebrates Beowulf's victory over Grendel by way of allusion to two figures from earlier poetic traditions, and this is the next slide. Hullum kuningus thein guma gilpladen, jida jemundig, say the eilfella eil jeseana warn jemunda, word other fand, soth jebunden, sedge eft on gan sith Beowulf's snitrum sturian, and on sped reckon spell jerada, wordum rixlen, well whilch je quath, that he from Sigmundus sean hördes elendadum, uncouthus fella, walsingers yewin, weeda sithas, thara they gumena bern garwane wisten. So sometimes the king's thane, a man laden with stories, remembering songs, he who a great many of old sayings remembered from afar, he found other words truly bound together. The man afterwards began to recount Beowulf's tale skillfully, and successfully to recount a story, to change with words. He said a great deal that he had heard said about Sigmund's famous deeds, many unknown things about the exploits of Wal's son, far travels, things which the sons of men did not readily know. So I think this account of a Danish oral poet creating a new poem about Beowulf from existing materials can give us a useful way of thinking about the Beowulf poet's own compositional technique. Both poets possess knowledge of old tales beyond the memories of their audience, and both locate this original material in a traditional context by referring to what they've heard said. Another story which the audience of Beowulf probably did not readily know is that of Beowulf the Yat's 3 monster fights. This story doesn't survive in Scandinavian tradition, and most critics think it was probably an English addition to Scandinavian legends. So for the final part of this talk, I'm going to briefly discuss how the poem invites us to think critically about just how traditional Beowulf actually is. On his entrance into Heorot, this is his first real entrance in the poem, Beowulf declares his reputation as the binder of 5 giants and an unspecified number of nikaras, sea monsters. But this story is soon questioned by Hrothgar's Thyl, his kind of advisor, who's called Unferth. Unferth claims to have heard tales about Beowulf losing a swimming competition with a guy called Breca. And this is the next quotation. Unferth says to him, I'll just translate this for you, "Are you the Beowulf who competed against Breca in a swimming contest across open water, where in your arrogance you tried the waves, and for a foolish boast risked your life in deep water? He outswam you. He had more strength." In support of this case against Beowulf, we learn much later in the poem that the Yats had in fact considered Beowulf lazy and cowardly. But the budding hero denounces Unferth's version of events and casts himself as the greater swimmer of the two and brave vanquisher of 9 nikaras. So we can see Beowulf here performing a role equivalent to that of the traditional narrator and his shops. He's amplifying a version of his own tale before a listening audience. These same rhetorical skills are on display later when Beowulf returns to Hygelac's court and embellishes his tale of his adventures among the Danes. He adds all kinds of new details. He describes Grendel's glove, a kind of pouch in which he puts these corpses that he's going to eat. And he starts talking about Hrothgar's daughter, Freyawaru. None of this was mentioned before. Is he telling the truth? So Beowulf shares with the poet and his fictional shops a taste for poetic license, embellishment, and amplification. He declares before Unferth that he had the greater merestrengo, sea strength. And in his speech to Hygelac, he praises the company in Heorot as the most joyous under the heavens. So Beowulf invites its audience to consider the complex role of oral poets, in this case Beowulf himself, as mediators of stories which they must reshape with each new performance. Of course, Beowulf is not, in its present form, an oral poem, but it's a written text, whatever its origins may have been. After the conversion in the 6th and 7th centuries, Anglo-Saxon England underwent a transition from a state of primary orality, where the technology of the word was as yet unknown, to one of residual orality, where literacy is the preserve of an educated elite. Stories about Hrothgar or Hygelac must have originally circulated in oral form, given the illiterate nature of southern Scandinavia in this period. It's likely that some of these stories were also the subject of oral poems in Anglo-Saxon England. But as these tales encountered the literate culture of Christianity, they came to be copied into manuscripts and thereby fixed to some extent. It's impossible to say whether the interest in orality in Beowulf was inspired by the poet's first-hand experience of the performance of shops. When we talk about the Beowulf poet, we're really speaking of the individual or individuals who shaped these traditions into the text that we now read. So perhaps we should think of the term the Beowulf poet as a collective noun. So I hope that I've shown you some ways in which the Beowulf poet, or rather Beowulf the text, engages in an instructive metafictional discourse about the inherently unstable nature of oral storytelling. Thank you.